that's what this next session is going to be about, and I'm very, very grateful. If you could come up, please, David Limbrick MP, Dr. Duncan Syme, and Dr. Jayanthi Kunadhasan are going to speak in that order. I'm going to introduce them in reverse order. Dr. Jayanthi Kunadhasan, I had the pleasure of meeting a few months ago in Wangaratta when I emceed for an AMPS event. That's the Australian Medical Professionals Society. Look them up if you are a medical professional. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jayanthi there. She's been working with Dr. Naomi Wolf on the dissecting of the Pfizer papers. And this is a real what did we know and when did we know it kind of project. And it's amazing work that you're doing. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say today. Dr. Duncan Syme, I'm just going to simply say thank you for being on the right side of history. There were not enough of you. There were not enough people like you. And David Limbrick MP, well, he actually got out in the trenches with us while we were doing our crazy stuff down in Melbourne. He got out there and when he was kettled and threatened with arrest, he didn't pull the MP card. He wore it and he set an example and did so many courageous things. I'm not here to tell his story, but I will tell you that he's one of the best that we've got in Victoria, and that should be more of a compliment than it is. I don't mean to damn by faint praise, but I'm certainly very grateful for all that you've done, and we're going to hear from you first. David Limbrick MP.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Topher. I think the subject that we were talking about is the thin veneer. And I'll take a step back to what started me on being, involved in the liberty movement in the first place. Was the thin veneer was ripped off in an event that happened in the past. And I know that many people have been concerned about protecting liberty recently because of the pandemic. But actually what drove me to the cause and actually drove me to the Libertarian Party was an event that happened in the past. And it wasn't the event itself, it was the government's response to the event. Sound familiar? That event was 9/11. And what happened back then, the government responded in such a way that they took away people's freedoms, they degraded people's privacy, invaded their privacy, they created new draconian laws, and they even sent us into war based on lies. And that really woke me up. And I know there's been a lot of talk about Marxists and socialists, but it wasn't the Marxists and socialists that led us down this path at the time. It was actually the conservatives. But that got me interested in, well, what's the problem here? Like the real danger here is the state itself. And that got me interested in the liberty movement, and I joined the Libertarian Party and eventually got elected into Parliament. And one of the first battles that we fought in Parliament, this is before the pandemic, was forced DNA collection for suspects of crime. And we're libertarians, we care about bodily autonomy, we care about people's privacy and this sort of thing. And what the state wanted to do, the police had told them it would be much easier to solve crimes if we didn't have to worry about going to a court and getting a warrant to collect someone's DNA, if a senior police officer could just do it instead. And Tim and I'd like to acknowledge Tim Quilty, my comrade in arms. We fought very, very hard against this because we thought it was a gross violation of people's rights. And if you want to take someone's DNA, you get a warrant. You don't you don't just get a senior policeman to approve it. Anyway, we fought really, really hard against that. We got a little bit of media coverage, but basically no one cared. No one cared. They wanted to just hand over these powers to the cops. Then the pandemic came. Now you got to remember, in Victoria at the pandemic, we libertarians are very sceptical about emergency powers, but when the pandemic started, we'd just come out of emergency powers, and this was for the bushfires that happened at the time. And they used these emergency powers. We were worried about them using them at the time, and to our pleasure, I suppose. They made mistakes, but generally they didn't really abuse these powers too much. There was problems, but it wasn't too bad. So when they announced the emergency powers when the pandemic started, that was our experience at the time. And we were concerned, again, because they're bringing in these emergency powers. But what happened during the pandemic was very different. And we started questioning early on, what are they doing here that is effectively they're overriding people's rights. So initially it was the right to freedom of movement, then freedom of association, the right to work, and then later on it was the right to medical treatments with full and free consent. And their justifications for these were secret. We thought that's not good enough, surely. That's crazy. And we started fighting against it. And we fought against it to the point where Tim and I even got kicked out of Parliament at one point because they dictated that you had to have a vaccine in order to be an MP. And we said, we don't think that's a very good idea. And they kicked us out of Parliament. Much to their horror, we ended up having a good time in a nightclub and running Parliament remotely from there, which was fun. But what lots of people don't understand, and this is true of the 9/11 response and also true in the pandemic, that it wasn't really the government that was making these decisions. What they did, they actually handed over power to the bureaucracy, to public health bureaucrats. And they abrogated their responsibility to take ethical decisions and take responsibility for those decisions, and they said, we're going to listen to the expert advice. That's what they did. And they handed over power to these people, and these people would happily use any authoritarian means possible. In fact, they gave them such narrow objectives and such wide limitations on achieving those objectives that they pretty much could do whatever they wanted. Like, for example, everyone knows about, transmission numbers. That was broadcast every day on television. They had media conferences every day talking about transmission numbers. That was their KPI. Now, they didn't think about the wider effects of what they might do through their actions because they weren't being measured on that. They were just being measured on transmission numbers. And they had the power to do whatever they want. So of course they tried to lower transmission numbers through any means possible. And those means caused some real harm. Like the worst harm of all, which I'm still concerned about, and I think by far it's the biggest harm of any during the pandemic, was when they closed the schools. And I said to the education minister at the time, he accused me of wanting to run an experiment by letting kids go to school. And I retorted back to him and I said, you're running an experiment right now. We've never shut schools down. We don't know the long-term effects of locking kids up for what turned out to be years. And we're only now just starting to see the horrific effects of that. Cutting children off from their education, cutting them off from their social life. I remember we used to have limits on screen time and all of a sudden, everything is in front of a screen. That's their only social interaction. We're only just starting to learn the types of damage that this has caused. And even worse, later on in the pandemic, we had, of course, vaccine mandates. And when they first started developing vaccines, we were like, oh, well, that seems normal. Like, you've got a disease, you try and develop, remedies and vaccines for it. But then they made it mandatory. And this totally overrides, and I'm sure my colleagues here on the panel will have a lot more to say about this, but it totally interferes with the concept of full and free consent to medical treatment when your job or your freedom of movement or your social interactions are dictated by whether or not you choose to take this medicine that the government has dictated that you have to. And this was the problem, not that, there might be risks associated. I mean, there's risks associated with every medicine, of course. But people need to be able to make informed consent on these things. And consent is really what it comes down to. And consent is at the core of libertarian ideas. The idea of a voluntary society is a society that revolves around consent. And that's our goal, that's our ideal in a philosophical sense. And so I think what we need to do in terms of looking at what we did, we've been calling for a royal commission into the COVID response. They don't want to look at it, as people have said. They're all scurrying away, all of the bureaucrats and the politicians that were involved in this. But we do need to look at what we did because we need to understand the harms that were caused. We need to understand the rights that were violated and the reasons, the justifications, the piss-poor justifications in many cases for those rights being violated. And we need protections to make sure it doesn't happen again. The explosion in the power of public health was only demonstrated by the pandemic, but it continues now in other areas. Like, for example, the public health likes to pretend that they regulate tobacco harm reduction at the moment. Well, we're talking about vapes and tobacco. The reality is that it's actually regulated by organised crime in Victoria, at least, and yeah. And interestingly, we were throwing around this idea in my office the other day that if organised crime is the ones supplying vaping, are they actually doing more for public health than public health is? It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. But I think that we need to seriously question public health and the institution itself of public health, and never ever again allow governments to hand over control to technocrats, because this is what happened during the pandemic. This was the problem, and they did it way back when over the 9/11 response. It was other technocrats, not in public health, but handing over control like this and not making the moral judgments about defending the rights of the people that you're meant to represent was a fundamental mistake that must never happen again.